The Thompson submachine gun felt different in Murphy's hands as he crouched behind the stone wall outside San Pietro. Not heavier, he'd carried it through enough Italian mountains to know its weight by heart, but somehow more present, as if the weapon itself understood that today would demand everything from both of them. The morning mist swirled around the skeletal remains of a German half-track, still smouldering from yesterday's fighting, and Murphy counted his remaining magazines for the third time. 5 left, plus the one loaded. Maybe 150 rounds total against an entire German strongpoint. The 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding through the Italian mountains for weeks, each village a puzzle of stone walls and hidden machine gun nests. San Pietro should have fallen 3 days ago, but the Germans had turned the Crossroads into a fortress that commanded every approach to the valley beyond. Murphy's company, what was left of it, had been reduced to 30 exhausted men sharing frozen rations and dwindling ammunition. The promised resupply convoy had never arrived. Sergeant Brandon lay in an aid station tent behind them, his left shoulder torn open by shrapnel from yesterday's failed assault. Before the medics carried him away, he'd grabbed Murphy's sleeve with his good hand. "You're the most experienced man in the section now," he'd whispered, though Murphy was barely 20 years old. "They're going to look to you." Murphy studied the German positions through gaps in the morning fog, memorizing the rhythm of their machine gun bursts, counting muzzle flashes. The enemy had chosen their ground well, a cluster of stone buildings that dominated the intersection, machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Any frontal assault would turn the open ground into a killing zone. The other soldiers in his section kept glancing at him now, their faces carrying a mixture of respect and desperate hope that made his stomach tighten. Private Collins, barely 18, and still writing letters home in a careful schoolboy script. Corporal Jensen, who'd lost 2 fingers to frostbite but refused evacuation. They all knew the tactical situation as well as he did. They couldn't stay pinned down much longer, but any attack would likely get them all killed. Word had come down the line that German reinforcements were moving up from the south. If the company didn't break through by noon, they'd be surrounded. The mathematics were brutally simple, and Murphy found himself checking his Thompson again, running his fingers along the familiar contours of the receiver. He'd learned to fire in controlled bursts rather than the wild spraying that got so many replacements killed. 3 or 4 rounds at a time, aimed shots that conserved ammunition and found their targets. The plan forming in Murphy's mind bordered on insane. While the squad provided covering fire, he could work his way around the German left flank using a drainage ditch that ran parallel to their line. The morning fog would provide concealment, but only for another hour at most. Once within 50 yards of their strongpoint, the Thompson's .45 caliber rounds could suppress the machine gun nest long enough for his men to advance. He knew the odds were against him. The ditch would leave him isolated, cut off from support if things went wrong. Even if he neutralized one position, 2 more machine gun nests still covered the Crossroads, but Murphy also understood something that couldn't be written in any manual. Sometimes in war, impossible was just another word for necessary. Collins crawled over, his young face tight with worry. "Murph, what do you think? Can we punch through?" Murphy looked at the Thompson in his hands, then at the faces of the men counting on him to find a way forward. The weapon had become an extension of himself over the past months, reliable, precise, deadly when it needed to be. Today, every round would have to count. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. Murphy began his movement at first light, sliding into the drainage ditch that paralleled the German line. The muddy bottom squelched under his boots, and he winced at each small sound, certain the enemy would hear him coming. The Thompson felt heavier with each step, its familiar weight now a reminder of the impossible task ahead. The fog provided perfect concealment, but Murphy knew it wouldn't last. Already he could see the sun climbing higher, beginning to burn through the mist that had shrouded the Italian valley since dawn. Behind him, 50 yards back, his squadmates waited in their positions behind the stone wall. Jensen had taken over as section leader, but everyone understood that Murphy's flanking movement was their only chance of breaking the stalemate. As he moved through the ditch, Murphy could hear German voices drifting through the morning air, casual conversation, someone complaining about the cold. The sounds reminded him that the enemy soldiers were just as cold and tired as his own men, probably just as homesick. But they held the high ground, and the heavier weapons, which meant sympathy, was a luxury he couldn't afford. 20 yards from the German positions, Murphy settled into a firing position, bracing the Thompson against the lip of the ditch. Through a gap in the stone wall, he caught glimpses of Feldgrau uniforms, the distinctive silhouette of an MG-42 machine gun, nervous movements of soldiers who knew they were being hunted. The machine gun crew was positioned perfectly to sweep the entire approach to the Crossroads, as long as they remained undisturbed. Murphy had learned hard lessons about automatic weapons during the months fighting through Italy. The Thompson fired a heavy, 45 caliber bullet that hit with devastating effect at close range, but its effectiveness depended entirely on disciplined fire. Spray wildly, and you'd empty your magazine, hitting nothing but air. Fire-controlled bursts at carefully selected targets, and the weapon could change the course of a battle. The first burst caught the German machine gun crew completely by surprise. Murphy's rounds stitched across their position with methodical accuracy, forcing them to abandon their weapon and scramble for cover. Before they could recover or call for help, he was already shifting his aim to a second position, his Thompson spitting fire in short, precise bursts. The key was not getting carried away, not emptying his magazine in a wild spray of bullets. Every round had to serve a purpose, either eliminating an enemy soldier or driving him away from his weapon. Murphy had seen too many good men die because someone panicked and wasted their ammunition in the first 30 seconds of contact. From his position in the ditch, Murphy could see his squad beginning to move forward, using the covering fire he provided to advance from one piece of cover to the next. Jensen led the way, his bandaged hand clutching his rifle, while Collins and the others followed in a staggered line. The Germans, confused by the unexpected attack from their flank, were struggling to reorganize their defense. But Murphy knew this was just the beginning. 2 more machine gun nests commanded different approaches to the Crossroads, and the Germans would recover quickly from their initial surprise. His Thompson had maybe 100 rounds left, enough for perhaps 5 more sustained engagements if he maintained fire discipline. The morning fog continued to thin, revealing more of the battlefield with each passing minute. Soon the Germans would be able to see exactly where the fire was coming from, and then Murphy's position in the ditch would become a trap rather than an advantage. He checked his remaining magazines again, then focused on the next target, a machine gun position built into the ruins of a farmhouse that dominated the eastern approach to the Crossroads. The second machine gun nest proved more stubborn than the first. Murphy's initial burst drove the German crew to cover, but they quickly adapted to his position, returning fire that chipped stone and dirt from the edge of his ditch. The MG-42's distinctive buzz, saw-ripping sound filled the air, punctuated by the sharper crack of rifle fire as other German soldiers joined the fight. Murphy pressed himself against the muddy wall of the ditch, waiting for the enemy fire to slacken. The Thompson felt slick in his hands now. Whether from condensation or nervous sweat, he couldn't tell. Behind him, he could hear Jensen shouting orders to the squad, coordinating their advance, while Murphy kept the Germans' heads down. A runner had arrived just before Murphy began his flanking movement, bringing word from company headquarters. The promised artillery support wouldn't be available. The guns were committed to supporting another unit's attack further north in the Italian mountains. Air support was grounded by the same fog that had concealed Murphy's approach. The company would have to take the Crossroads with whatever they had on hand. The mathematics hadn't improved. 30 men against an entrenched German strongpoint, with ammunition running low and no prospect of reinforcement. Murphy counted his remaining Thompson magazines, 3 left, plus the one in the weapon. Maybe 75 rounds total. Not enough for a sustained firefight, but possibly sufficient if every shot counted. Private Collins had worked his way forward during the firefight, using shell holes and rubble for cover. Now he lay in a crater 20 yards behind Murphy's position, close enough to provide support, but far enough back to avoid the concentrated German fire. "Murph!" he called during a lull in the shooting. "Jensen says the 3rd machine gun nest is giving the squad trouble. Can you see it from there?" Murphy raised his head cautiously, scanning the German positions. The 3rd nest was positioned in the ruins of what had once been a church, its machine gun barrel protruding through a gap in the stone wall. From its elevated position, it commanded a perfect view of the entire Crossroads and the approaches his squad would have to cross. The tactical problem was becoming clear. Murphy could probably neutralize the 2nd machine gun position with careful aimed fire, but doing so would expose him to the 3rd nest. And even if he eliminated both positions, the Germans had reserves. He could see more soldiers moving through the ruins, repositioning to meet the American attack, but the alternative was retreat, and retreat meant abandoning the Crossroads to the Germans. It meant watching the company's attack fail, meant more casualties in future attempts to take ground they should have secured today. Most importantly, it meant failing the men who were counting on him to find a way through the maze of enemy fire. Murphy checked the Thompson's action, ensuring the bolt moved smoothly. The weapon had performed flawlessly so far, but he'd seen too many firefights decided by a jammed rifle or a misfed cartridge. In combat, mechanical reliability often mattered more than superior numbers or better positions. The fog was almost gone now, revealing the full extent of the German defenses. Murphy could see enemy soldiers moving between positions, their officers gesturing toward his location in the ditch. Soon they would coordinate their fire, or worse, send a squad to flank his position while their machine guns kept him pinned down. Collins called out again. "Orders from Jensen. He says take whatever shot you can, when you can. He's moving the squad up in 2 minutes whether we're ready or not." Murphy settled the Thompson stock against his shoulder and selected his next target. 2 minutes to break a position that should have required an artillery barrage. But sometimes in war, what should happen and what must happen were entirely different things. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Murphy's world narrowed to the Thompson's front sight post and the German machine gun position 40 yards away. The fog had lifted completely now, revealing every detail of the battlefield in sharp morning light. He could see the enemy gunner's helmet behind the MG-42, the way the barrel moved as the Germans searched for targets among the advancing American soldiers. The mathematics of the situation demanded impossible precision. Murphy had perhaps 60 rounds remaining in his Thompson, facing multiple machine gun nests that each required sustained fire to neutralize. But mathematics couldn't account for the discipline he'd developed over months of combat, the ability to place each burst exactly where it needed to go. His first burst caught the 2nd machine gun crew as they tried to traverse their weapon toward Jensen's advancing squad. 3 rounds, carefully aimed, sent the German soldiers scrambling away from their position. Murphy immediately shifted to the 3rd nest in the church ruins, his Thompson barking out another controlled burst that forced the enemy gunner to duck behind his stone shield. The pattern became rhythmic, almost mechanical. Burst, shift, burst, shift. Each time a German soldier tried to return to his weapon, Murphy's fire drove him back to cover. He wasn't trying to kill. Though some of his rounds undoubtedly found their marks, he was simply denying the enemy the ability to use their heavier weapons against his advancing squadmates. Collins had worked his way forward to a position where he could provide covering fire with his rifle. "I count maybe 15 Germans still active," he called during a brief lull. but they're getting organized. Looks like they're trying to flank your position." Murphy had seen the same movement, grey uniforms working through the rubble, attempting to get behind his location in the ditch. Once they achieved that position, he'd be caught in crossfire with no way to retreat. The Thompson held maybe 40 rounds now, not enough for a protracted firefight against superior numbers. But Jensen's squad was almost to the crossroads. Murphy could see them moving from cover to cover, advancing steadily while his fire kept the German heavy weapons suppressed. Collins, Jensen and the others were depending on him to maintain that suppression for just a few more minutes, long enough for them to reach positions where their rifles could be effective. The German flanking movement was getting closer. Murphy could hear their boots crunching through debris, their whispered commands as they coordinated their approach. In perhaps 30 seconds, they would have clear shots at his position. The smart tactical choice would be to withdraw now, while he still could. Instead, Murphy shifted to a new firing position within the ditch, one that gave him a better angle on both the remaining machine gun nests and the approaching German infantry. The Thompson felt perfectly balanced in his hands now, as if the weapon itself had adapted to the rhythm of the fight. 2 magazines left, plus the rounds in his current magazine. Maybe 30 shots to finish what they'd started. The German soldiers attempting to flank his position came into view around a pile of rubble. Murphy's first burst sent them diving for cover, but they were close enough now that he could see their faces, young men, probably no older than himself, following orders and trying to stay alive in the chaos of combat. That moment of recognition lasted perhaps a heartbeat. Then the demands of the tactical situation reasserted themselves, and Murphy was back to the disciplined application of firepower that had kept his squad moving forward. The Thompson spat out another controlled burst, then another, each one precisely aimed and carefully rationed. Jensen's voice carried across the battlefield. "Last 50 yards. Keep them down, Murph." The Thompson's bolt locked back on an empty magazine, the metallic click loud in Murphy's ears despite the chaos of battle around him. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, dropping the spent magazine and seating a fresh one, his last. 28 rounds remaining between his squad's success and disaster. What the after-action report would never capture, what no citation could adequately describe, was the moment of pure terror that washed over Murphy as he realized the true extent of his isolation. The German flanking force had worked closer during his last magazine change, close enough that he could hear individual voices, the scrape of equipment against stone. Behind him, Jensen's squad was committed to their advance across open ground, depending entirely on his continued suppression of the enemy positions. The secret that would haunt Murphy for decades afterward wasn't about courage or tactical brilliance. It was about the moment when every rational instinct screamed at him to withdraw, to save his own life while he still could, and his decision to stay anyway. Not from heroism, but from the simple inability to abandon the men counting on him. Collins had worked his way to within 10 yards of Murphy's position, close enough to see the mathematical reality of their situation. "Murph, you need to get out of there. There's too many of them." Murphy could see what Collins couldn't from his angle. Jensen and the others were almost to the crossroads, but not quite close enough to support themselves with rifle fire if the German machine guns came back into action. 30 more seconds of suppression, maybe 45, and the squad would reach cover among the buildings. Anything less, and they'd be caught in the open when the enemy recovered. The Thompson had become an extension of Murphy's will, each burst fired with the precision that months of combat had drilled into his reflexes. But precision couldn't change mathematics, and mathematics dictated that 28 rounds couldn't suppress multiple machine gun positions and hold off a flanking attack simultaneously. The German soldiers attempting to get behind his position were close enough now that Murphy could distinguish individual faces. One of them, hardly older than Collins, was speaking rapidly into a field telephone, calling for artillery support probably, or requesting reinforcements. The smart thing for Murphy to do would be to target the radio operator first, disrupting German communications and buying more time. Instead, he found himself hesitating, seeing not an enemy soldier, but someone else's kid brother, someone else's son writing letters home in careful script. The moment of hesitation lasted perhaps 2 seconds, long enough for the German radio operator to complete his transmission, long enough for Murphy to understand that some costs couldn't be calculated in advance. Then Jensen's voice cut through his paralysis. 30 seconds, Murph. We're almost there. Murphy's next burst was directed at the machine gun nest in the church ruins, 3 rounds that sent the German crew scrambling away from their weapon again. He shifted immediately to the second position, then back to suppress the flanking movement, his fire controlled and deliberate despite the chaos around him. The Thompson's ammunition counter in his mind read 15 rounds, then 12, then 8. Each shot had to accomplish something specific, drive an enemy away from his weapon, force a head down at a crucial moment, buy 1 more second for his squadmates to reach safety. When the bolt locked back on the final empty magazine, Murphy found himself in a silence that felt deeper than any he'd ever experienced. The German positions were temporarily suppressed. His squad was moving into the buildings around the Crossroads, and he was alone in a muddy ditch with an empty submachine gun and nowhere to run. The Crossroads fell not through any single heroic gesture recorded in the official reports, but through the accumulated weight of Murphy's disciplined fire and his squad's steady advance. By the time Collins reached his position in the ditch, the surviving German soldiers were already withdrawing towards secondary positions further up the valley, their defense disrupted beyond recovery. Murphy sat with his back against the muddy wall of the ditch, field-stripping his Thompson with the mechanical efficiency that had become second nature. His hands weren't quite steady, and Collins pretended not to notice as he helped sort through the scattered empty magazines. "How many rounds did you have left?" Collins asked, though he probably already knew the answer. "None," Murphy replied, his voice hoarse from shouting commands during the firefight. The Thompson lay in pieces across his lap, each component being cleaned and inspected with the same careful attention he'd applied to his marksmanship. The weapon had performed flawlessly, but Murphy understood that its effectiveness had depended entirely on his ability to use it with discipline rather than desperation. Jensen appeared at the edge of the ditch, his bandaged hand still clutching his rifle. "Company commander wants to see you, Murph. Says there'll probably be some kind of commendation." He paused, looking at the scattered German positions. "Hell of a thing you did down there." But Murphy was thinking about the German radio operator he'd hesitated to target, wondering if that moment of recognition had cost American lives somewhere else along the line. The mathematics of combat were always incomplete, the consequences of each decision rippling outward in ways that couldn't be calculated in advance. 3 months later, at a ceremony somewhere behind the lines, a colonel would read a citation describing Murphy's actions at San Pietro. The official language would transform the muddy ditch into a forward position, his ammunition shortage into aggressive fire and movement, his terror into conspicuous gallantry under fire. The Thompson submachine gun wouldn't be mentioned by name, reduced to personal weapons in the bureaucratic prose. Collins would be there for the ceremony, along with Jensen and the other survivors of that morning. They would stand at attention while the colonel pinned a medal to Murphy's uniform, and later they would get quietly drunk together, not talking about what the citation had failed to capture, the weight of decisions made in seconds, the faces of enemy soldiers who looked too much like themselves. Years later, when Murphy was an old man living in Texas, the sound of certain machinery would sometimes bring back the morning mist at San Pietro, the weight of the Thompson in his hands, the mathematical certainty that he should have withdrawn from that ditch. On those days, he would remember not the medal or the citation, but Collins working his way forward to provide covering fire, Jensen advancing his squad across open ground, and the simple impossibility of abandoning men who were counting on him. The weapon itself would eventually find its way to a museum, cleaned and polished and displayed behind glass with a small placard describing its role in the Italian campaign. Visitors would read about rates of fire and ballistic performance, but they wouldn't learn about the discipline required to make each shot count, or the weight of carrying that kind of responsibility for the rest of your life. In his sleep, decades after the war ended, Murphy would sometimes dream about empty magazines and German radio operators who looked like somebody's kid brother. But he would also dream about Collins and Jensen and the others making it safely across that crossroads. And in those dreams, the mathematics finally balanced. If this story reminded you that behind every medal, there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.